Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest edition of Elie on Air. I am thrilled to be here with three esteemed rabbinic colleagues, as I am not a rabbi. But my name is Miriam Brosseau, and I am the program director of Elie Talks, and excited to be welcoming you to this conversation, Keeping Faith in Rabbis, Rabbinical Education. How's that 5-year model doing? Looking forward to a really dynamic conversation with some luminaries in the field, and they'll be sharing some of their experience and some of their wisdom for moving forward. Just a couple of words about this lovely forum that we're in and what the possibilities are. We hope to make this a very interactive conversation. If you would like to submit any questions to our panelists, feel free to do so in the Facebook event, which is likely where you found out about this, and we will keep an eye on that. You can also submit through Google+. If you are signed into your Google account currently, then you likely see a little black box with some yellow writing down here in the corner of your screen. Click on that. It'll open up a Q&A app where you can submit questions, and we will keep an eye on those as well. You can also use Twitter, tweet at Elie Talks, at ELI_talks, and we'll keep track of those questions as well. And we look forward to hearing from you. But with that, we will. I'd love to hear a quick introduction from our my partner in crime in putting together this particular conversation, Rabbi Hayim Herring, to say a few words about our topic today and the book on which it is based.
Thank you, Miriam. So, what goes into the making of a 21st century rabbi? It was really that question that was the impetus for editing a book with my co-editor, Elie Rasher, Keeping Faith in Rabbis, a community conversation on rabbinical education. And it is the first volume to bring together the voices of educators of rabbis and lay leaders, all those who are stakeholders in rabbinical education and leadership. We received 30, or decided to print actually 31 essays from 33 different contributors. There's an online component. If you go to my Facebook page at hayimherring.com, you'll see that it's a continuing conversation, and that's why it's such a pleasure to be here with you today and with my rabbinic colleagues, Elie Kaunfer and Debra Rappaport. The key word in the phrase of the book is community conversation, because that's really what we don't have enough of. There are conversations that happen in pockets and isolated silos, and look, we know that we're facing challenges, changed definitions of what is to be Jewish or to be a part of a Jewish family, younger generations who care deeply about being Jewish but defy denominational labels, and how do we trust tradition and still embrace disruption? Rabbinical schools, the new ones, the established ones, those who are preparing rabbis are all aware of these challenges, and that's why I think that's enough of an introduction to turn the program back over to you so that you can then begin this component of our discussion today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Chaim. So I'd like to begin by just asking the three of you to tell us a little bit about your own rabbinical school experience. And specifically, I'd love to hear something about how you were different coming out of rabbinical school than you were going in. And so with that, I'd like to start with Debra. Would you like to kick us off?
Sure. I picked RRC, which I think is, you know, I feel like I need to start there because I grew up Reform. I studied and loved many conservative friends and colleagues and explored other movements and found my home in the Reconstructionist movement. I went in because I liked the civilizational curriculum and the support of what's called supervision. In other words, an opportunity to try on lots of different rabbinic roles and come back and sit down with each other and with somebody experienced in the field and talk through the challenges and what went out. I mean, after 7 years, of course, I'm a different person. I know a lot more Hebrew. I didn't start learning Hebrew till I was in my 30s. So that was probably the biggest challenge and the biggest accomplishment for me.
Mm. Excellent, thank you. So Rabbi Debra Rappaport, and I'll pass it on next to Rabbi Elie Kaunfer. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your rabbinical education and how you changed?
Sure. So I went to rabbinical school. My dad is a rabbi, and many of my relatives are rabbis. And my own biography was knowing that I actually wasn't going to go to rabbinical school and surprising myself and others by ending up in rabbinical school when realizing that that was really the best way to pursue my life's passion, which was about building Jewish community and working in Jewish education. I think for me, the experience of being in rabbinical school as somebody who entered already having spent 7 years in the non-Jewish workforce, working for the city and for a law firm and an investment bank, was really going in knowing what I wanted to get out of school. And I think the two main things that I took out of school at JTS, number one was a much deeper understanding of how to read rabbinic texts in a more nuanced and sophisticated manner. And the other was being proactive about building some relationships with a certain number of teachers who were there who remain advisors and mentors for me.
Excellent, thank you. And Rabbi Hayim Herring, tell us your story.
Well, in all candor, my parents would not let me go to Yeshiva University, but JTS seemed to be a compromise. I did not come from a particularly observant home, and I just knew that I was leaving home. So at least we could agree upon one school, and it was the best choice that I could have made. I had a very shallow sort of textual Judaic background, and I really left JTS very at home in rabbinic texts. I had quite a positive experience all throughout, and I attended at a transitional period where I was able to study with some of the faculty members who were European and the young and budding scholars who really were products of America. So it was a good place and a good time.
Great, excellent. So we've just had a few people join us as viewers. I just want to shout out a reminder that if you have questions for our panelists, Rabbi Debra Rappaport, Rabbi Elie Kaunfer, and Rabbi Hayim Herring, then please feel free to share them in the Facebook group, via Google+, or over Twitter. Just shout your questions to @Eli_talks, and we'll keep track of those as well. So great, thank you for giving us a little bit of introduction and a little taste of where you're coming from. Let's just dive into the meat of this conversation. What do you believe works about the current model of the current most pervasive model of rabbinical education? Let's just start with that before we get into any of the other details. What's working? Where are the bright spots? Anyone would like to jump in?
So I'll just shout out a few, and Elie and Debra can highlight quite a number more. I like the move toward spiritual direction and formation. I think that's really vital. The kind of Beit Midrash style learning that Elie can certainly speak to more, I think has been a wonderful improvement. Pastoral education, and I think there's some really talented faculty across all the different rabbinical programs.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. What else is working? Debra, really?
Well, I think the answer varies institution to institution. Mm-hmm. And in order to talk about what's working, I feel like we need to back up a little bit and talk about what the goal of rabbinic education is, what it is that rabbis need to do in the world in order to be educated appropriately. To me, it's about bringing the stories of Jewish life, Jewish education, Jewish texts, traditions, rituals to bear in helping people live lives of meaning. And cope with change, and that was another plus about working and learning in the Reconstructionist movement is the understanding foundationally that change has always been part of Jewish life. This is not new now. It may be accelerating now, but Jews have always been adapting to changing circumstances. And so each seminary has a lot of elements that are working. I would agree with Hayim in the specific ones that he highlighted. I also think that institutions, by definition, have strengths and weaknesses. So by having an institution, you get a group of people together, and there's much more strength and power by having a community than having, isolated pods. But almost by definition, then, by having this kind of community, it's slow to turn, and some of the different seminaries are leapfrogging one another and then seeing what others are doing and responding to that.
Elie, do you have thoughts to add?
Yeah, I guess I would pretty much echo my colleagues on what's working. I think it also depends, as Debra said, on what the goal is, and I think from what I hear, this wasn't my personal experience, but from what I hear, what rabbinical school is able to provide a lot of people is a community of colleagues that are on a similar journey that people can take with them into their career beyond school. In some ways, the fact that you have a critical mass of people who are pursuing some unified goal and can feed off each other's energy and passion, just the very fact of gathering those folks together is a major plus.
Can I say something else to that? You don't need rabbinical school to have a solid Jewish education if you come from a more traditional Jewish community. Those of us who have different experiences growing up may be able to already come in providing different things out in the field, but I, for one, needed the actual Jewish training in the Hebrew, in the texts, in the traditions, in the stories, in how to approach them and apply them. And so I don't want to bypass the essential learning that the rabbinical schools provide.
Well, and I think that brings up an interesting point, right? I mean, the term for being ordained as a rabbi is smicha, and if I'm understanding it correctly, it used to refer to literally laying your hands on someone and kind of transferring this line of tradition down from one leader to the next. And I think that classical understanding of what smicha is has all kinds of assumptions built in, right? That there is a certain amount of learning that has already happened. At this age, the child learns the Chumash, and at this age, you learn the Mishnah and Gemara and all of these things that have already sort of happened along the way. So, but obviously today's Jewish community looks very, very different, and we can't make those kinds of assumptions. So are there, what do, I guess the question then is, what can rabbinical schools assume about the students coming in, or what could they take for granted? What could they see as obvious things about these students coming in?
Well, I'm going to jump in on that one because, from my perch, I have an opportunity to take a look at many different kinds of rabbinical schools. And again, it's important not to generalize too much. There are some very clear differences. So if you're looking at the liberal rabbinical programs, I think assumptions are really up for grabs today. This whole notion of spiritual formation has to be accompanied with the notion of just Jewish identity formation. And this is what Debra was alluding to before. You can't take for granted today that rabbinical students who are moving into the liberal schools and programs are coming in with a very thick Jewish experience in the way that you used to. and again, these generalizations are annoying, but depending upon the Orthodox program that we're talking about, one can bring in a different set of assumptions about how much Jewish learning a student might bring in. But even then, it's not quite as clear as it used to be.
Yeah, I would jump in, related to that question. I think it is not something well articulated in rabbinic training generally in the liberal schools about where exactly the right mix or the right standard is for creating a rabbinic cohort. In my experience, groups are different when the majority are coming to Jewish text learning or Jewish identity in a thick way in the year or two before going to rabbinical school versus throughout a sort of a childhood and adolescent education. Now you could make a value judgment on that one way or the other, but to sort of recognize the changing landscape about what the population is seems to me directly related to the question of how is the course of study run? How long is the course of study? What's the focus? What are the expectations coming out of it? And it's not clear to me that that's fully been digested and articulated. At least when I was more in it, as a student, and things may have changed now. But I think it is just a different landscape, and as a result, if the project of rabbinical school is to teach people how to read rabbinic texts as a first activity, I mean, if the first real time you're exposed to that is in rabbinical school, then it's a different enterprise than taking somebody who's had 12 or 15 years of Jewish education and taking them to some other educational plateau.
Against my nature, I'll just be terse and say, to Elie's point, who is looking holistically at the cohort of rabbinical students who are coming in, I think is a very important and neglected question.
I respectfully differ because I'm pretty darn sure the Reconstructionist movement is looking holistically at that, to whatever degree that anyone is able. But the assumptions that we can make about there are very few assumptions we can make anymore about what everybody has in common who wants to be a rabbi. What we can talk about, I think, is the sense of rabbinic formation that involves a really strong comfort with an ability to pass on the tradition and really strong interpersonal and community building skills, and and a lot of other things that will shape where people go and serve in the world. And so it's hard to generalize. I mean, and of course, God, spirituality, that whole conversation is fairly new in rabbinical schools in the last 15, 20 years too.
Yes, and I would also add, in Keeping the Faith in Rabbi, some of the essayists, including those from the Reconstructionist movement, spoke about the difficulty not just of rabbinical formation, but for many students coming in today, and Elie, you must see this as well, even though you're not running a rabbinical program, people may be entering rabbinical school and beginning their Jewish journey at the same time. So they're on a path of experimentation while they're in the midst of this very intensive experience. They don't have that kind of background when they come in, and that journey then has to continue when they're out in the field.
Well, and if, as Elie articulated, somebody who comes in with 15 years of Jewish learning has a very different kind of not only Jewish learning to do in rabbinical school, but also perhaps development of a different set of skills that somebody else who was already a stockbroker, a lawyer, or a therapist, or something else has already developed.
So what are the what does a rabbi need to know, right? We had an Elie talk from Rabbi Jeremy Fine, who posited that in today's world, a rabbi needs to look and dress like a CEO. They need to be treated like the quarterback of a team, and really have to be given fundraising experience. That's part of those are the expectations of a rabbi, if not the traditional role of a rabbi. And when we think about where rabbinical students end up going in their careers, it's not just congregational settings by any means anymore. And so if there aren't really a clear set of assumptions that we can make about the students coming in, are there commonalities in what they should be getting out of it?
Well, I'll jump in. Just in thinking about this question, I remember that I picked up a while ago at a used bookstore this volume of Judaism, which I'll just put up to the camera here, which is from 1969, where the question is, they held a symposium on the future of rabbinic training in America. And among the respondents in 1969 was Art Green. You would recognize many of the other names in the list here, but the main symposium kickoff was a presentation by the Reform Rabbi Daniel Jeremy Silver. And he starts off his address with two short sentences, which I think are relevant to your question, Miriam, which is, he says, the rabbinate is not, in the first instance, an occupation. The rabbinate is, first and foremost, the pleasure and mastery of Torah. And I think that is a framework that, there are so many roles that a rabbi plays, and specifically, I assume what Jeremy was talking about is a pulpit rabbi would play CEO, a quarterback, a counselor, a pastor. It's many professions rolled into one. But I think the deepest question that's at stake is, how much do we believe the success of a rabbi is tied to their experience and mastery of Torah, and how much of that is an add-on that is nice, or for the advanced crowd, or for the really motivated, but at the end of the day, Torah and Torah education is not really relevant to being a good pastor, relating to people where they are, even maybe delivering a sermon. And I think from my perspective, to the extent that those skills become severed and people start asking questions like, well, why am I studying Talmud? I need to learn practical rabbinics. You start to wade into the question of what is the distinction between a rabbi and other helping, guiding professions, which have very wonderful pathways to teaching the skills of counseling and pastoring. And I think it's obviously, from my perspective, a question of balance. You can't only learn Talmud and expect to absorb the other skills. But I think to the extent that we prioritize what our relationship to the traditional texts are and how that relates to what being a rabbi is, then you're looking at it, in the words of Rabbi Silver, not as an occupation per se, but as a relationship to Torah and how that flows forward.
So, Elie, I'm very intrigued by what you just shared, and I love it. When I think about the communities that I've served since I've become a rabbi, bringing access to Talmud has been so far from what I'm generalizing, of course. There have been a few people here and there who are ready and willing and interested and able to study Talmud. But Talmud's a great example of something that not only do you have to know Hebrew and Aramaic, and there's a whole set of cultural assumptions, so that even if the uninitiated goes and studies it in translation, then without a teacher, they're completely lost. And so if you understand the role of a rabbi as teacher, maybe not as an occupation, but as teacher primarily, and maybe even teacher of Jewish life, Jewish tradition, you still have to meet the people where they are, and we're specializing within the communities that we serve in. So if I had I think 3 semesters of Talmud and several more of other kinds of rabbinic texts. But if I'd spent a whole lot more there, it would have been really fun and engaging for me. but very few scenarios where I could pass that kind of wisdom on.
If I could just offer a sort of different frame, because I think I agree with you on the Talmud as a subject matter to be taught, especially in the amount of time that lay people usually have to devote. I'm excluding now the thousands and tens of thousands of people who are studying a page of Talmud every day. Talmud is not, as you said, it has some high barriers to access. What I'm speaking about less is about the rabbi as teaching the text of Talmud to a busy laity, but rather the rabbi as somebody who, in their own spiritual life, and as a place where they go to derive strength, meaning, and purpose in all of the activities of meeting people where they're at, is drawing from a deep wellspring of Torah. And I think that is something that takes time and I would say ongoing work on. I know for myself, sometimes I see with myself, some of my colleagues, that rabbinical school itself is treated in some ways the way we treat the bar mitzvah preparation, which is to say you spend a lot of time studying for something, then it happens, and then you pretty much don't do it anymore. How many bar mitzvah students are reading Torah, and how many rabbis are studying in the intensive way that they were doing in school? I think part of the challenge of when you think about what is the right amount of study or devotion, or how many courses do you take in Talmud in your rabbinic education, the question in my mind more is, how is a rabbinic life able to be oriented around the never-ending relationship to Torah? And how can it be that somebody who does have these other roles to play, maybe even primary roles to play as CEO, pastor, guide, etc., is finding the time to engage in that study and in that relationship, really, that's providing the wellspring and the groundedness that defines them as a rabbi.
Beautiful.
And I would just want to jump in as someone. It's a little frightening to be the one with the most experience now, but here we are. A rabbi is not an ATM, an automatic Torah machine. And people who want to learn information and acquire it have a million different access points. I mean, Jewish learning has been democratized, and it's incredibly exciting. But a rabbi, regardless of the position that he or she holds, whether it's full-time, part-time, once you assume that title, and once you begin to internalize what that means, you realize that you are living Torah in your relationships. You begin with relationships, and those relationships are hopefully informed by your understanding and your growing internalization of Torah that changes throughout the decades, but can end with rabbinical school, and actually at points needs to be intensified. But I want to make sure that we don't overly narrowly define what we mean by Torah when we're talking about rabbis as people who immerse themselves out of a sense of a calling, and through that have everything that they do encountered through that prism with people
Beautiful.
and relationships.
Great. I'd like to shift just a tad, but I think this will play off some of the direction that we've been going. So we've talked a little bit about the students coming in and what we might be looking for with rabbinical students coming out and taking on their roles in leadership in the community. But let's think about rabbinical education in the broader context. There are all kinds of issues that surface and resurface in the Jewish community writ large, and these are blatant generalizations, and I'm sure there will be more throughout the course of this conversation. But to what extent do you all believe that institutions of rabbinical education should be leading the charge, should be pulling the community in a certain direction? And to what extent do you feel that institutions of rabbinical education should be following where the community is going?
I'm going to go first because I'm going to be brief. Build the foundation of, again, Torah in the broadest Kaplanian sense of the word, I would say. Do it deep, do it a little bit faster, I would say, and don't try to educate people for what the community may look like 10 or 20 years from now, to your point about leading the charge, but give rabbis this paradoxical ability to both be deeply rooted, right, authentically in however we're understanding Torah, but understand that the new norm is instability. We're not going from a period of discontinuity to continuity where things are going to settle down, not for the foreseeable future. So don't try to anticipate 50 years out, but give rabbis that comfort level to both stay rooted and also to be to kind of thrive in this new environment.
Other thoughts? Hayim, I think you nailed it.
The nuance of your Miriam, I didn't quite get the nuance of your question. I mean, it would seem to me, well, you have to be in a leadership position. On which specific access are you talking about? Following the community or leading them? Like in what?
I was just trying to avoid the specific things, but so we're still. I see from my point, sort of looking in on the professional Jewish community, that we're quite hung up on the results of the Pew study, for instance, and our latest census and counting ourselves. And there were, for instance, there's a moment in the study that says that many Jews connect to Judaism through humor, for instance. And so should it be the job then of rabbinical institutions of rabbinical education to focus more on humor and to make sure that either the rabbis that are produced from these places are able to tap into that better, or literally be funny, or whatever it is. So I'll take that as a very light example.
Well, I actually got an A in humor at rabbinical school, but it was actually the history of humor, so I didn't really learn that much about humor and how to practice it. I mean, I think by that example, you sort of answer your own question for me, which is to say, I think the language that rabbis should have access to has to be in the idiom of the day, otherwise people can't relate. But to say that what people report in the Pew survey is all that people ever will be or can be is a little bit defeatist, in the sense that, I don't know, from my perspective, I think there is a general human yearning that, for all of the instability that we experience in the modern age, it remains pretty constant. And I think the rabbi's goal needs to be to tap into that yearning and to relate to it. I think that's how I would relate to those listing on the Pew. I mean, interesting. The number one thing on that list in the Pew study was remembering the Holocaust, which across all ages and backgrounds was in the 70th percentile of what's most important about being Jewish. In my rabbinic education, we had 0 classes on the Holocaust. I think in some ways there is a reaction in the Jewish professional class about the Holocaust being overplayed. But if you were going to simply use Pew as a guidepost, then you would say, great, we'll mainly talk about the Holocaust, and we'll do some humor and eat some lox,
But look, I mean, please go ahead, Debra.
I come from the technology industry, and we have lots of good models there because it's always coming up with new things that nobody knew they needed. Nobody envisioned an iPad or an iPhone until the technology folks created it, and then we all needed it. But so the Jewish parallel to that is what I agree with Elie's articulation, that everybody has a longing for meaning and connection, and that it's our job to keep finding and cultivating new ways. So to be ahead, coming back to your question, to be ahead in leading, in helping people make those connections, meeting them where they are, but bringing Judaism and continuing to do our own deep learning. I mean, I feel like I've been able to keep doing that because of the work I've done with the Institute for Jewish Spirituality and the work I've done with the Musar Institute and the work I've done with, I'm starting a more Derek program most likely, and these are all tool sets that we can bring, but we have to keep growing and staying ahead in order to invite people to come along with us, so it's not limited to rabbinical school.
And I just wanted to add, Miriam, to your question again about leading, I think that we have to trust that rabbinical students who will then become rabbis will also know what it is that they need, as Debra's saying and as Elie provides at different times, to continue their growth so that they can lead. I wouldn't put the burden on the school to try to lead the community, but that is one of the requirements, one of the privileges and one of the burdens of being a rabbi, and that is to help lead and to help anticipate. We know, for example, or I would guess, that ultimately that pendulum, that technology pendulum that causes people to look down, not out of a posture of humility, but because they're looking at their smartphone, right? That's going to eventually change, or maybe that's an area of leadership, reclaiming what it means to be human in some fashion. But I wouldn't expect a school or a course to do that. I would expect a school and continuing rabbinical education, and here I'm going to put in a plug, a lot of rabbis engage in it. I don't understand why it's not mandatory still, but continuing education is also the time to begin to keep on that path of growth and to remain on it and to look a little bit further ahead, to peer ahead into the future.
So tell me a little bit about continuing rabbinical education. What are some of the options that rabbis can take advantage of? And I'm sure, as with so much in this conversation, it varies from institution to institution and community to community. But broadly speaking, what does that look like, and what role does that play in the life of a rabbi working in their community?
Now, I've probably worked with a couple hundred rabbis over the years, and launched, involved, and have benefited from many programs. So again, it's hard to give an answer. The good news is that there are more options today, both through seminaries, through independent learning institutions, in the States and in Israel, online, than there have ever been before. If I'm not mistaken, in the case of the CCAR, there's a very strong encouragement, especially strong with certain pathways that are laid out to continue. But I think the Alliance for Continuing Rabbinical Education, an organization called ACRE, along with the movements, have recognized that need for continuing education. I look at continuing education as a lifelong process again. Getting back to what Jeremy Fine said in an earlier talk, I think it also has to be negotiated with rabbi and community, whether it's a rabbi who's in a day school teaching, a camp, or a congregation, things that nurture the rabbi, but also help the community that he or she serves.
Elie, do you want to talk about, I'd love to hear about Machon Hadar.
Thanks for the setup. Yeah, no, I mean, just speaking from my own institutional knowledge, we offered at Machon Hadar a rabbinic, we call it our rabbinic yeshiva intensive week in January, really just trying to recognize that there was a desire among rabbis in the field to come to a week where it was not framed as professional development per se. It was framed of stepping back into the Beit Midrash and engaging in the active study on topics and texts that are particularly relevant, but nevertheless are not sort of served up and spoon-fed, but need to be unlocked. And I think the ability for a rabbi in the field to jump back into the learning mode, to sit with a chavruta and to try to puzzle out a rabbinic concept or rabbinic text is incredibly energizing for people. And I think the most powerful moment of the week is when my colleague, Shai Held, basically instructs everybody not to think about how they're going to use what they learned in their next sermon or adult ed class, but really just to take this as a moment to remind themselves what Torah Lishma can feel like and can be. And to a person, it's extremely energizing with no larger agenda than that.
I've also gotten a lot out of my work with the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, which puts together rabbinic cohorts from across the movements with 36, I would say, on is a typical cohort size, and we're together for a period of 2 years, which involves 5-day intensives and Havruta study and a commitment to either a meditation or a yoga practice. And the Havruta study is Hasidic texts as translated and interpreted and given over with discussion questions by Jonathan Slater. And so it's all sorts of different aspects of mindfulness practice, from mindful davening to silence to mindful eating to yoga to meditation to the text study to listening to one another. And it also is, I wouldn't call it professional development, it's personal development in a very Jewish context, pulling elements from other traditions sometimes, but that's deeply nourishing. And also there, we're encouraged, at least for the first year, to not come back, not think of how we're going to teach it. It's really hard not to.
And the other thing that this is an opportunity to put a general plug in for is sometimes, and I see it in congregations, when budgets get tight, continuing education, professional development is cut. And that is, I think it's a very serious error for all the kinds of reasons that we're hearing and that you can imagine. But great learning opportunities, every denomination, independent, online, in Israel, here, very rich variety today.
So I'd like to shift our focus to the future a little bit as well, and this 5-year institutional model of rabbinic education is relatively modern, and yet there's already these other alternative-ish models that are coming to challenge it, including entirely online smicha programs. Online education has come up a couple of times in this conversation. So I put it to you. I mean, how do you see rabbinic education changing in 10 years, 50 years, 100 years? What do you predict will be some of the shifts in form and in content moving forward?
I'd like to just put a few questions out there rather than presuppose what things might be, because we are in a very kind of fluid state right now. But when I take a look at edX or Coursera, right, I begin to ask myself, why can't we have core courses, right, really high-quality courses that are requirements in all of the different rabbinical programs that students could take and kind of move at their own pace? Learning Hebrew, is that something that has to be done in classrooms of 12 to 15 in places scattered across? I understand there are issues of time zones, but I mean, I think we're just behind in thinking about how students might be able to pace themselves more, and also be able to, in some ways, design their own rabbinical program, having again some sort of core, but something that plays to their strengths and their passions. And I know that in established institutions that are accredited, it seems like an impossibility, and maybe it is, but I think we've got some serious catching up to do in that area.
I'll just jump in again from because I thought it was nothing new under the sun. In the nothing new under the sun category, so Rabbi Silver writes in this symposium in 1969, he says, the institutional separation of our traditional seminaries is an avera. Each student needs courses, men, perspectives, ideas which no insulated seminary can provide him. Yet almost all rabbinic training is carried out in splendid isolation, yes, even in the middle of New York. So I think that the proposal that there could be efficiencies of scale that could be capitalized on is not new, and obviously it seems to be some external factor that's preventing that from happening. I mean, I think that just to note, Miriam, on your question, obviously the vast, vast majority of rabbis in the Jewish world do not go through the 5-year system. They go through their own system, either in Israel or in the Haredi yeshivas. And if you just look at the numbers, this is like a tiny speck on the general group of rabbis that are out there in the larger Jewish world, if you're willing to consider that part of the same Jewish people. I think looking at that model of Jewish education as rabbinic preparation, it would also be instructive. I think part of what struck me in someone who did go through a 5-year program is that of all the graduate schools, and at the end of the day, rabbinical school in a university is a graduate school experience. Of all the graduate programs that I'm aware of, I don't think there are any courses of study that have more classes than rabbinical school. Like, I took 50 classes in rabbinical school. Medical school, law school, you know, any of the professional schools are not set up in that way. So I think part of what's interesting is what are we trying to accomplish in that course of study, in those 50 academic courses, and in what way are the other rabbinical programs in the non-university oriented rabbinical training programs, or even in the newest programs like Hebrew College is a university, but YCT, which isn't connected to a university, how are those essentially critiques on the existing model that ask the question of what are we doing in those 5 years, as opposed to is the length of time the right amount of time?
And I would throw Aleph into that mix as well as a critique upon or a response to current 5-year models too.
And what Aleph does well, I think, is have cohorts, even though there's distance learning. The community piece is really essential. And that was part of why I wanted to actually go to Philadelphia and go to rabbinical school, because I wanted to not just learn with people, but daven with them and be in community with them, and, you know, go through life with the people, because that's what part of what I felt like I was learning as a rabbinical student. One of the other things I would just add that just feels relevant to this conversation about what it might look like going forward is the cultural assumptions that we make. When we find out where someone went to school, for instance, there are all sorts of things we infer because we share an American culture. For instance, if you're traveling in a foreign country and you meet somebody, you can't, with 3 questions, know a whole world about them the way you can with our shared American cultural assumptions. And so which seminary you went to means something, means a whole, and it may be wrong. You know, it's a generalization. But there's something to be said for having smicha from a recognized place, that it's not just a name or a title, it's a whole set of things that people know you learned, you've gone through, and things that maybe you haven't, and that you still could, you know, that they'll have to check other places for your credentials on the things that you didn't learn there. Do you know what I mean? It's not, I'm not trying to hold back the conversation about it. I'm just trying to acknowledge that matters.
And to which I would say, to whom does it matter? So within certain professional circles, rabbinic circles, I mean, you know, clearly there's an insider-outside conversation. If you've been through certain programs, then you're sort of, okay, then I guess you're kind of a rabbi, or we acknowledge you as a rabbi. If you're functioning in a community, and here is a concern that I have about that quality issue. if you're functioning in a community and you've gone to, there are bogus rabbinical programs out there, and we know that. You don't have to know Hebrew, you don't have to know too much Hebrew, you just have to know how to give a sermon, and you're functioning as a rabbi, and people in a community accept you in that role, then it matters less to them where you got your education than how do you function in their community. And that is something that I actually have a concern about.
I would say...
What's your concern about it?
Well, as we began the conversation, however a particular program or denomination might define, sort of mastery and internalizing the Jewish tradition writ large, those programs, they can't make those claims. These other programs, I think, can do so quite honestly.
I feel like, I don't know, in a world in which there's broad competition and open marketplace, I feel like at the end of the day, I'm not so worried about those pop-up rabbinical school phenomenon, because more so than in the past, I feel like this is maybe a positive development. People are judging rabbis on the end product, not on their ideological association or their denominational affiliation. I feel like people want quality. Quality usually wins. To the extent that it doesn't win, I think it speaks larger issues in the in the demands of what American Judaism is looking for. But I do believe that people can recognize quality and want quality, and as a result, as long as schools are turning out quality, there's really no threat. Except for the fact, except in some sort of parallel scenario in which the only role of a rabbi is to get someone married, or to perform sort of a state-sanctioned religious clergy role where you need to dial up the person who's going to do it the quickest and the cheapest. If you're going for any deeper connection to a rabbinic teacher, then I feel like quality is going to win the day, and that's what's going to drive the successful schools.
Which involves a screen on the way in, as well as the program and the smicha. There's a lot of people look for a rabbinic education, trying to figure out what they want to do with their lives, and spirituality sounds cool, and so we also rely on the institutions to do some screening about who can be this, a madrich ruchani, it's a spiritual escort or a teacher representing our tradition.
Well, as a rabbinic community, I think that issue of screening, quality control, assurance, we've all been damaged by scandals both within rabbinical communities as well as within clergy communities as well. So that's why the quality issue is certainly paramount. I think that people are skeptical whether or not established programs give the guarantees that people once thought. And Elie, I'm not sure that you're giving enough weight to the ability of people to call themselves rabbis, speak a little bit of Hebrew, give a wonderful shiur, and really not have that depth that we each spoke to in our own way. They can be perceived as very high quality in terms of their emotional intelligence, the relationships that they build. I'm a little bit more concerned than you are.
Well, we'll let that tension hover for just a moment. I'd like to close on one quick question. So we just have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to ask you in one line or one tweet, if you were going to give any piece of advice to someone currently considering rabbinical school, what bit of wisdom, what bit of Torah perhaps would you pass along to that person?
I would give this advice to someone considering rabbinical school or any kind of graduate school, which is get as much experience as you can first, so that you have what to hang your new learning on.
Yeah, I would 100% agree, and I feel like I would piggyback on that by saying, be honest with yourself about why you want to go to school. Is it because you like being in school, or do you want to be the profession that school is going to turn you out into?
And in addition to really checking your motivation thoroughly, I mean, there's no downside to taking a year and learning Torah if you decide that you don't want to go to rabbinical school. So it's not a, to me, it's never a loss. But if you're interested in Jewish learning, that may not be the same thing as wanting to become a rabbi. And if you're, after you've thoroughly investigated your own motivations and talked with other people and understood, you know, their journeys and talked to more experienced colleagues, have an additional profession that you can rely upon as well.
Beautiful.
Excellent. And that's a beautiful endnote from someone who majored in Jewish studies and then didn't decide to go to rabbinical school, and I feel like I made the right choice, to three people who did go to rabbinical school and I think absolutely made the right choice and are making considerable contributions to the community. Thank you all for sharing your time and your talent and your wisdom. Thank you to all of our viewers for sticking around for this conversation. To be continued on Elie Talks and In Keeping Faith in Rabbis. Please check out the book. Go to hayimherring.com and check out all the cool things Chaim is up to. And we'll have more of these conversations in the future. So thank you again to our panelists, Rabbi Debra Rappaport, to Rabbi Elie Kaunfer, and to Rabbi Hayim Herring. Again, I'm Miriam Brosseau from Elie Talks, and we'll see you all next time. Take care.
Thank you.